a rich woman, a fidgeting waitress, and something unexpected. The crystal chandelier above table 12 had witnessed 1,000 business deals, countless first dates, and more breakups than anyone cared to count. But it had never seen anything quite like what was about to unfold on that rain-soaked October evening. Morgan Ashford sat beneath it, her Armani blazer perfectly tailored, her diamond earrings catching the light with every subtle movement of her head as she reviewed quarterly reports on her tablet, completely unaware that the nervous young woman approaching with a water pitcher was about to shatter the carefully constructed wall she'd spent 38 years building around her heart. The restaurant, Marcella's, was the kind of place where a single appetizer could cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget, where the wine list read like a novel, and where reservations were booked months in advance. Morgan came here every Thursday evening without fail. Always alone, always at table 12, always ordering the same thing: seared salmon with asparagus, no dessert, one glass of Chardonnay. The staff knew better than to make small talk with her. She was polite but distant, generous with tips but never with her time or attention. She was exactly the kind of wealthy patron who kept high-end restaurants in business. Predictable, uncomplicated, and utterly unremarkable. In every way except for the black credit card she slid across the table at the end of each meal. But tonight the regular waitress had called in sick, and in her place stood 26-year-old Emma Chen, who had started at Marcella's just 3 weeks earlier and was still learning to navigate the unspoken rules of serving the ultra-wealthy. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she filled Morgan's water glass, not because she was intimidated by wealth itself, but because she'd made the catastrophic mistake of looking directly into Morgan Ashford's eyes, and what she'd seen there had stopped her breath in her throat. Behind the cool professional exterior, behind the perfectly applied makeup and the practiced indifference, Emma had glimpsed something raw and achingly familiar, loneliness so profound it seemed to echo in the space between heartbeats. Emma knew that look because she'd seen it in her own mirror every morning for the past 2 years, ever since her ex-girlfriend had left her for someone more ambitious, more successful, more everything, working double shifts at the restaurant, living in a studio apartment barely large enough for a bed and a kitchenette. Emma had convinced herself that she was fine, that she was building towards something better, that the exhaustion and the emptiness were just temporary conditions on the road to an uncertain future. But seeing that same hollow ache reflected in the eyes of a woman who supposedly had everything made, Emma's carefully maintained composure cracked just enough to be dangerous. The first real connection happened over a spilled drink, which is perhaps the most cliché beginning to any love story, but sometimes clichés exist because they're rooted in the messy, unexpected reality of human experience. Emma had been carrying a tray of cocktails to a nearby table when another server backed into her path unexpectedly, and before she could compensate, a $12 martini was cascading across Morgan's tablet. Her reports and the sleeve of that expensive blazer. Time seemed to slow down in the way it does during small disasters, and Emma watched in horror as Morgan's eyes widened, not with anger as Emma had expected, but with something that looked almost like surprise, as if the universe had just played an unexpected joke and Morgan couldn't quite decide how to react. What Morgan did next changed everything. Instead of demanding to speak to a manager or making a scene that would have gotten Emma fired on the spot, she started laughing. It wasn't a polite chuckle or a forced attempt to seem gracious. It was genuine, unguarded laughter that seemed to surprise Morgan herself, as if she'd forgotten what it sounded like. She looked up at Emma, who was frantically apologizing while dabbing at the mess with cloth napkins, and said something that would replay in Emma's mind for months to come. Sometimes the universe has to literally throw a drink at you to get your attention. The words were spoken softly, almost to herself, but Emma heard them, and in that moment something shifted between them, some invisible barrier crumbling like sand. Morgan waved away Emma's apologies, insisted that the blazer had needed cleaning anyway, and asked for another water glass instead of filing a complaint. She even smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and made her look younger, softer, more human than the Ice Queen persona she wore like armor. Emma brought the water with trembling hands, and when their fingers accidentally brushed during the exchange, both women felt it. That electric jolt of recognition that has nothing To do with logic and everything to do with the inexplicable ways souls sometimes recognize each other across the distance of vastly different lives. Over the following weeks, Thursday evenings became the focal point of both their weeks, though neither would have admitted it out loud. Morgan still sat at table 12, still ordered the same meal, but now she arrived earlier and lingered longer, finding excuses to need refills or extra napkins or recommendations from the dessert menu she'd previously ignored. Emma traded shifts and called in favors to ensure she was always working Thursday nights, her heart rate picking up every time the restaurant door opened, settling into a rhythm of anticipation and nervous energy that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. They talked in fragments, stolen moments between Emma's other tables, conversations that started superficial and gradually deepened. Layer by layer, revelation by revelation, Morgan learned that Emma had studied literature in college but had dropped out when her father got sick and the medical bills had consumed everything her family had saved. Emma learned that Morgan's empire of success, the tech company she'd built from nothing into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, had cost her every meaningful relationship she'd ever had, including her marriage to a man she'd tried to love the way society expected but never could. They didn't talk about the obvious attraction growing between them. Instead, they circled around it carefully, like two people approaching a fire, drawn to its warmth but afraid of getting burned. The turning point came on a Thursday in late November when Emma noticed Morgan sitting at table 12 with tears streaming silently down her face, her phone clutched in one hand, her usual composure completely shattered. Without thinking, without considering the professional boundaries or the power imbalance or any of the 1,000 reasons why it was inappropriate, Emma sat down across from her. The restaurant was quiet. The dinner rush hadn't started yet, and for once, Emma didn't care about protocols or rules. She simply reached across the table and took Morgan's hand, holding it while Morgan fell apart in a way she probably hadn't allowed herself to do in decades. Morgan's mother had died that afternoon. They'd been estranged for 15 years. Ever since Morgan had tried to come out to her family and been told in no uncertain terms that she needed to choose between being honest about who she was or remaining part of the family, Morgan had chosen honesty, and it had cost her everything except her career. She'd thrown herself into work, built walls so high that nothing could hurt her, convinced herself that success was enough, that she didn't need love or acceptance or any of the soft things that made people vulnerable. But sitting in that expensive restaurant, holding hands with a waitress who barely knew her but somehow understood her completely, Morgan realized how desperately lonely she'd been, how the price of her carefully constructed life had been far too high. Emma didn't offer platitudes or empty comfort. She just listened as Morgan talked, really talked, for the first time in years. She talked about her mother, about the little girl she'd been, who'd loved books and dancing and had dreamed of being an artist before the world had taught her that dreams were dangerous. She talked about building her company as a form of revenge, proving to everyone who'd rejected her that she could succeed without them, only to discover that success without connection was just another form of emptiness. And Emma shared her own story in return. The weight of unmet expectations, the fear of never being enough, the quiet desperation of working yourself to exhaustion just to survive while watching life pass by like scenery through a train window. When the restaurant started filling up and Emma had to return to work, Morgan didn't leave. She stayed through the entire evening service, watching Emma move gracefully between tables, seeing her in a completely different light. Here was someone who treated every customer with genuine warmth, who remembered regulars' names and favorite dishes, who somehow maintained kindness and grace despite being overworked and underpaid. Morgan found herself thinking about all the assistants and employees she'd barely noticed over the years, all the people who'd been invisible to her because she'd been so focused on climbing higher, achieving more, proving herself to people who'd never cared anyway. Their first real date happened 2 weeks later, and Morgan insisted it wouldn't be at Marcella's. She picked Emma up in her Tesla, but instead of taking her to another expensive restaurant, she drove to a tiny Vietnamese place in Emma's neighborhood where the tables were plastic and the menu was handwritten, and the food was absolutely extraordinary. Morgan admitted she'd been Googling best cheap eats for days, wanting to step into Emma's world rather than demanding Emma continue navigating hers. They talked for 4 hours, long after they'd finished eating, discovering shared loves of old movies and obscure poetry, debating everything from politics to whether pineapple belonged on pizza, laughing until their faces hurt. But dating across class lines across different worlds wasn't the romantic comedy they'd both secretly hoped for. Morgan's friends and colleagues made their disapproval clear, some subtly, others brutally directly. Emma faced whispers and judgment from her co-workers who assumed she was a gold digger, while also feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the vast material gulf between their lives. When Morgan casually mentioned a weekend trip to Paris as if it were no more significant than going to the grocery store, or when she bought a piece of art that cost more than Emma would make in 5 years without blinking, the differences between them felt insurmountable. They had their first real fight on New Year's Eve. Morgan had surprised Emma with a diamond bracelet that cost more than Emma's annual rent, meaning it as a romantic gesture but not understanding how it made Emma feel like a kept woman, like someone whose value could be measured in expensive gifts, like all the ugly stereotypes she'd been fighting against. Emma exploded, all her insecurities pouring out in an angry torrent, about not being a charity case, about wanting to be an equal partner, rather than someone who needed rescuing. Morgan, hurt and defensive, fired back about Emma's pride, about refusing help being just another form of self-sabotage, about how love sometimes meant accepting that people wanted to take care of you. They didn't speak for 3 weeks. And those 21 days felt longer than all the lonely years that had come before. Emma went through the motions at work, her smile brittle and forced, while Morgan threw herself back into her company with the same desperate energy she'd used to escape her feelings for years. But this time the work didn't fill the void. Nothing did. Because once you've experienced genuine connection, genuine love, going back to emotional numbness feels like dying slowly. The reconciliation came not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through quiet honesty. Morgan showed up at Emma's apartment on a Tuesday evening. No expensive car, having taken the bus for the first time in 15 years. She stood in the hallway looking uncertain and vulnerable, so different from the confident businesswoman who commanded boardrooms. And she said the words she'd been practicing the entire bus ride. "I don't know how to do this. Loving someone, being loved back. But I want to learn, and I'm sorry for not listening when you tried to tell me what you needed." Emma let her in, and they stayed up all night talking, really talking, about their fears and expectations, about what equality meant in a relationship where resources weren't equal, about how to build something together that honored both their truths. If you've ever felt like you don't belong in someone's world, or that love might not be enough to bridge the distance between different lives, I hope this story is touching something in your heart. If it is, would you do me a kindness? A like, a share, or even just staying until the end would mean everything. These stories are for you, and knowing they resonate makes all the difference. They found their rhythm slowly, through compromise and communication. Morgan learned to ask before giving, to understand that Emma's independence wasn't rejection, but self-respect. Emma learned to accept help sometimes, to understand that Morgan's generosity came from love, not pity, and that letting someone care for you wasn't weakness but trust. Morgan started volunteering at a literacy nonprofit where Emma had been tutoring for years, discovering fulfillment in giving back rather than just accumulating more. Emma enrolled in online classes, finishing her degree not because Morgan pushed her but because Morgan believed in her enough that she started believing in herself again. They moved in together after 8 months, not to Morgan's penthouse but to a modest townhouse they chose together, a space that felt like both of theirs rather than one person's world that the other was entering. They navigated the stares and comments when they went out together, Emma in her thrift store finds and Morgan in her designer clothes, learning to not care what strangers thought because they knew their own truth. They had hard days and arguments and moments of doubt. Because real love isn't a fairy tale where everything becomes perfect. Once you find the right person, real love is choosing each other, again and again, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. A year after that spilled martini changed both their lives. They went back to Marcella's for dinner, this time as customers together at table 12. The chandelier above them sparkled exactly as it always had, but everything else was different. Emma wore a dress Morgan had helped her pick out, and Morgan wore Emma's grandmother's vintage necklace, each carrying pieces of the other's world. They ordered the seared salmon to share, and when the waitress brought their food, Morgan left a tip that was generous but not excessive, including a handwritten note about how everyone deserves to be seen, to be valued, to be treated like they matter. Before I tell you how this story ends, I want to ask you something. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you that love can be found in the most unexpected places, would you leave a comment below? Just a word, an emoji, anything to let me know these stories matter to you. Your engagement helps these stories reach people who might need them. The truth is, Morgan and Emma's story doesn't have a neat ending because their story is still being written. They're not perfect, and their relationship isn't perfect, but they're real and they're trying, and they've found in each other something neither knew they were missing. A home that isn't a place but a person. A love that isn't about grand gestures but about showing up, day after day, choosing each other in 1,000 small ways that add up to a life. Sometimes the universe doesn't throw a drink at you to get your attention. Sometimes it sends you a person who sees past your armor to the aching heart beneath. Someone who challenges you and frustrates you and makes you want to be braver than you've ever been. And sometimes that person is standing right in front of you, holding a water pitcher with trembling hands, waiting for you to really see them. The real tragedy isn't that we might fall in love with the wrong person, but that we might be too afraid, too proud, or too wrapped up in our own worlds to recognize the right one when they appear. Morgan learned that having everything means nothing if you have no one to share it with. Emma learned that accepting love doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. And together, they learned that the most unexpected love stories are often the ones that change us most profoundly, breaking us open in the best possible way, letting light into all the places we'd kept dark for far too long. Their story is a reminder that love doesn't care about bank accounts, or job titles, or any of the superficial measures we use to divide ourselves from each other. Love cares about recognition, about two souls seeing each other clearly and choosing to stay, choosing to try, choosing to believe that what you build together is worth more than anything you could build alone. And beneath that crystal chandelier at table 12, where 1,000 stories had played out before and 1,000 more would follow, their story became one more piece of evidence that magic is real, that transformation is possible, and that sometimes the most extraordinary thing that can happen in an ordinary life is finding someone who makes you believe in extraordinary things again.